The dust settled on the main street of Redemption Springs as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered boardwalks. Thomas Blackwood sat motionless atop his dappled gray stallion, surveying the town with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. At 52, his face was a roadmap of hardship, deep lines etched by years of squinting across sun-scorched plains, a jagged scar running from his right temple to the corner of his mouth. A permanent reminder of a knife fight in Abilene that should have killed him. His silver-streaked dark hair fell just below his collar, and beneath his worn leather duster hung a Colt Peacemaker that had become more extension than tool. The town had changed in the 15 years since he'd last laid eyes on it. The railroad had finally pushed through, bringing with it the mixed blessings of progress. A larger general store, a 2-story hotel replacing the old boarding house, and 3 saloons instead of 1. Thomas nudged his horse forward, the animal's hooves clopping rhythmically against the hard-packed dirt. He hadn't wanted to return, but the letter burning a hole in his pocket had given him no choice. Some debts couldn't be settled with money, and some promises couldn't be broken, even after all these years. He dismounted outside the Rusty Nail Saloon, tying his horse to the hitching post with practiced efficiency. Memories flooded back as he climbed the 3 steps to the wooden porch. Memories of laughter, gunshots, and blood. The last time he'd stood in this spot, he'd been riding away with 2 bullets in his back, leaving behind everything he'd ever loved. His hand instinctively moved to his side, feeling the phantom pain of old wounds. Thomas adjusted his gun belt, took a deep breath that tasted of dust and regret, and pushed through the swinging doors into the dimly lit interior. Inside, the saloon hummed with the subdued energy of mid-afternoon. Poker games in progress, a piano player half-heartedly tapping out a tune, the clink of glasses, and murmured conversations. Several heads turned toward the newcomer, sizing him up with the cautious appraisal of men who understood that strangers could mean either profit or trouble. Thomas ignored them, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on the bar, where a woman stood with her back to him, arranging bottles on a shelf. Even without seeing her face, he recognized the proud set of her shoulders, the crown of honey-brown hair now streaked with silver. "Sarah," he said, his voice a rough whisper that nonetheless carried across the room. The woman froze, her hand tightening around the bottle she held until her knuckles whitened. For a long moment, she didn't move, and Thomas wondered if she would pretend not to hear him, if she would refuse to acknowledge his existence after all these years. Then, slowly, she turned, her green eyes widening as they confirmed what her heart had already known from the sound of his voice. She set the bottle down carefully, as if afraid it might shatter at her touch. "Thomas Blackwood," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions crossing her face. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Her eyes traveled over him, cataloging the changes time had wrought. The new scars, the silver in his hair, the deeper lines around his mouth. Thomas removed his hat, holding it awkwardly before him, like a shield. He was suddenly aware of how much older he must look to her, how the years had carved away at whatever handsome features he might once have possessed. I'd like to pause for a moment and ask you kindly to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this story. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? Sarah moved from behind the bar with the same grace he remembered, though there was a slight stiffness to her gait that hadn't been there before. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, modest compared to the flashy attire of the other women working the floor, marking her as the proprietress rather than an employee. As she approached, Thomas caught the faint scent of lavender that had always been her signature, and something twisted painfully in his chest. She stopped a few feet away, maintaining a careful distance between them. "Your letter said it was urgent," Thomas said, his voice low to prevent their conversation from carrying to curious ears. "Said it couldn't wait, that I needed to come right away. I rode 4 days straight from Fort Smith." His eyes searched her face, looking for clues, for the real reason she had summoned him after so many years of silence. Sarah glanced around the saloon, at the men pretending not to watch their interaction while doing exactly that, and shook her head slightly. "Not here," she murmured. "My office is in the back." She turned without waiting for his response, leading the way through the crowded room. Thomas followed, aware of the speculative gazes following their progress. He kept his right hand loose, ready to drop to his gun if needed. Old habits died hard, especially for a man who'd spent 15 years looking over his shoulder. Sarah opened a door near the back of the saloon, revealing a small but tidy office with a desk, a few chairs, and a window overlooking the alley behind the building. Once inside, she closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, as if gathering her strength. The confident saloon owner momentarily gave way to a woman carrying a heavy burden. "You look well, Thomas," she said finally, though they both knew it was a courtesy rather than truth. He looked what he was, a man who had survived by being harder and meaner than those who wanted him dead. He didn't return the pleasantry, simply waited for her to continue. Sarah sighed and moved to her desk, pulling a drawer open and removing a folded piece of paper. "It's Rebecca," she said, watching his face carefully as she spoke their daughter's name. Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him, his mask of indifference cracking just enough to reveal the raw pain beneath. "She's in trouble, Thomas, the kind that might get her killed." She handed him the paper, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. Thomas unfolded it, with hands that weren't quite steady, revealing a crudely drawn wanted poster with his daughter's face staring back at him. The resemblance to her mother was striking, though he could see traces of himself in the set of her jaw, the intensity of her gaze. "Wanted for murder," he read aloud, his voice hollow. $500, dead or alive." He looked up at Sarah, disbelief warring with rage in his weathered features. "What happened? Where is she?" The questions tumbled out, 15 years of absence suddenly irrelevant in the face of their daughter's peril. Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the alley as if afraid she might see someone watching, listening. When she turned back to Thomas, there were tears in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "She killed Judge Monroe's son, Edward," Sarah said, each word careful and measured. "Shot him right through the heart in the middle of the street 3 weeks ago. There were witnesses. Half the town saw it happen." She took a shuddering breath. "But they didn't see what came before, what he did to her. Edward and his friends, they took her when she was coming back from delivering medicines to the Wilkins farm. They kept her for 2 days, Thomas. 2 days." Her voice broke on the last words, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. Thomas felt something cold and dark unfurl inside him, a familiar companion from his days as a bounty hunter. "Where is she now?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Sarah composed herself, straightening her shoulders with the resilience that had always defined her. She'd survived 15 years without him, building a business, raising their daughter alone in a town that would have happily seen her fail. She was stronger than he had ever been, and they both knew it. I sent her to my sister's place, near Copper Creek, up in the hills, she replied. But Monroe's men are searching everywhere, and there's a dozen bounty hunters already on her trail. The judge wants blood, Thomas. He doesn't care that his son was a monster. All he sees is that Rebecca killed his only heir, and he won't rest until she's swinging from a rope. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the strand of gray at her temple. I didn't know who else to turn to. You're the only one who can protect her now. Thomas folded the wanted poster carefully, tucking it inside his coat. The weight of responsibility settled on him, both familiar and foreign, after years of answering to no one but himself. Monroe, he said, the name like gravel in his mouth. Walter Monroe? The same man who had me shot and left for dead 15 years ago? The same man who took everything I had? Sarah nodded, and something like bitter satisfaction flashed across Thomas's face. Then it seems I have a score to settle with the judge and his whole damn family. Sarah caught his arm, her fingers digging into the weathered leather of his coat. This isn't about revenge, Thomas. This is about saving our daughter. Her green eyes bored into his, fierce with maternal protectiveness. Rebecca needs her father, not another grave to mourn over. Thomas covered her hand with his own, rough calluses against skin that still felt impossibly soft despite the years of hard work. For a moment, they stood connected by that simple touch, by the shared concern for the child they had created together in what felt like another lifetime. I'll bring her back safe, he promised, the vow as solemn as any he'd ever made. And I'll make sure Monroe and anyone who helped his son never hurts another soul. He didn't say what they both knew, that such a promise would likely cost him his life. Judge Monroe controlled everything in Redemption Springs and the 3 counties surrounding it. He had lawmen, hired guns, and bounty hunters at his disposal, not to mention the weight of so-called justice on his side. But Thomas had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous kind of enemy. Sarah searched his face, looking for reassurance, or perhaps for the man she had once loved. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and stepped back, breaking their connection. "There's something else you should know," she said, moving to her desk and opening another drawer. She removed a small leather pouch and handed it to him. Rebecca didn't just shoot Edward. She took something from him first, something that belonged to her mother, before Monroe stole it, along with everything else we had. Thomas opened the pouch and tipped the contents into his palm. A tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. He recognized it immediately. He had given it to Sarah on their wedding day, had fastened it around her neck with trembling fingers and promises of forever. Inside was a small portrait of the 3 of them, painted when Rebecca was just a baby. "She took this back from Edward before she killed him," he said, understanding dawning. That's why Monroe wants her dead so badly. Not just for his son, but because she has proof that his family steals from those they destroy. "The locket is just a symbol," Sarah replied, taking it from his palm and opening it to reveal the tiny portrait still intact inside. But symbols have power in a place like this. If people knew that the respectable Judge Monroe had ordered his men to steal from a woman after having her husband shot in the street. She closed the locket with a decisive snap. Rebecca didn't just kill the judge's son, Thomas. She challenged his authority, his narrative that he's a man of law rather than a tyrant. That's why he'll never stop hunting her. Thomas tucked the locket into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "How do I find her? Your sister's place near Copper Creek, you said?" Sarah nodded, moving to her desk again and quickly sketching a rough map on a piece of paper. As she worked, Thomas studied her profile, noting the strength that had only grown with time. She had always been the better of them, the one with integrity and courage. He'd been the gun, the violence made flesh. Perhaps that's why he'd had to leave. He had tainted everything he touched. While she had flourished despite the hardships. Take the North Trail out of town, Sarah explained, pointing to her drawing. After the split at Widow's Peak, head east through Rattlesnake Canyon. It's longer, but less traveled. Margaret's place is tucked against the foothills, hidden from the main trail. Rebecca will be watching for riders. She knows to expect you. She folded the map and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed again, and this time, Sarah didn't immediately pull away. Be careful, Thomas. Monroe has eyes everywhere. If they realize you're back in town, let them come, Thomas said simply. There was no bravado in his voice, just the calm certainty of a man who had long ago made peace with his own mortality. He tucked the map away and reached for the door, but Sarah's voice stopped him. She stood in the center of the small office, sunlight from the window illuminating half her face while leaving the other in shadow. A perfect reflection of the woman herself, Thomas thought, always caught between light and darkness, especially during the years they'd been together. What will you do, Thomas, after you find her? The question hung in the air between them, laden with 15 years of unspoken words. Thomas considered lying, considered offering her the comfort of a future that might include his return, their reunion, a family restored. But he owed her more than pretty falsehoods. Sarah had endured the truth of his absence. She could bear the truth of what must come next. He settled his hat back on his head, adjusting the brim to shadow his eyes. I'll do what I should have done 15 years ago, he answered. I'll kill Walter Monroe and anyone who stands with him. Then I'll make sure you and Rebecca are safe, with enough money to go wherever you want. Start fresh where his name means nothing. He didn't add the last part, didn't need to, that once the killing was done, he would disappear again. Men like Thomas Blackwood didn't get happy endings. They were weapons, not husbands or fathers, and weapons belonged in the darkness, not in the warmth of a family home. Sarah seemed to hear the unspoken words anyway. She crossed the room to stand before him, close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose that had always charmed him. She needs her father, Thomas. Not just a savior, not just a gun. She needs to know the man I loved, the man who used to sing her to sleep, who taught her to ride before she could properly walk. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The man who left because he thought we'd be safer without him, not because he didn't love us. Thomas looked away, unable to meet the knowing compassion in her eyes. That man died in the street 15 years ago, Sarah. 2 bullets in the back, left to bleed out in the dirt. His hand moved to his gun, the tool of his trade, the only thing he truly understood anymore. What came back was something else, something that's good for only one thing. Let me do that one thing for you both, and then... He let the sentence hang unfinished between them, an open wound neither could heal. Sarah reached up, her palm cool against his scarred cheek, turning his face back to hers. For a moment, time fell away, and they were young again. The former soldier finding peace in the school teacher's arms, building a life in a frontier town, dreaming of a future bright with possibility. Don't disappear on her again, she said softly. Whatever happens with Monroe, whatever you have to do, promise me you'll at least say a proper goodbye this time. It was a concession, an acknowledgement that she couldn't ask him to stay, couldn't expect him to become something he no longer knew how to be. I promise, Thomas replied, and he meant it. The words seemed to satisfy Sarah, who nodded and stepped back, composing herself once more into the capable businesswoman who had carved out her place in a man's world. She opened her desk drawer again and removed a small pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. She held it out to him, but Thomas shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "I have enough for what I need to do." Sarah put the money away without argument, understanding that his pride was one of the few things he had left. "There's a back door through the storeroom," she said, gesturing to another door on the far wall. "Fewer eyes that way." Thomas nodded in gratitude and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him one final time. "Thomas," she said, and something in her tone made him face her again. "Rebecca, when those men took her, they broke something in her, something I haven't been able to fix, no matter how I've tried." Thomas felt the familiar rage building again, but he kept his expression neutral, waiting for Sarah to continue. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to appear until now. "When I found her, when she finally made it home after killing Edward, she was different. Harder, colder." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "She said to me, 'Don't try to fix me, Mama. Don't break me more than I already am.'" Those were her exact words. Something twisted in Thomas's chest, a pain sharper than any bullet wound. "What did you tell her?" he asked, though he could guess the answer. Sarah's green eyes met his, filled with the fierce love of a mother protecting her child. "I told her that no one would ever break her again, that I would make sure of it." She took a deep breath. "But I'm just one woman running a saloon, Thomas. I can't protect her from Monroe and his men, from the bounty hunters and the law. That's why I sent for you." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility she was placing on his shoulders. "I'll find her," he promised again. "And then I'll find every man who hurt her, every last one." His hand moved to the butt of his gun, a gesture as natural as breathing. "And I'll break them instead." The words emerged as a growl, the vow of a predator rather than a man. Sarah didn't flinch from the violence in his voice. After all, it was exactly what she had summoned him to deliver. "God go with you, Thomas," she said softly as he turned toward the storeroom door. He didn't respond. His relationship with the Almighty had ended in the dirt of the main street 15 years ago. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect and slipped through the door, moving silently through the storeroom and out into the alley behind the saloon. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and Thomas used them for cover as he made his way back to his horse. As he mounted up, he cast one final glance at the rusty nail. From this angle, he could see the window of Sarah's office, could just make out her silhouette watching him depart. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different life, one where he had never left, where he had been there to protect his daughter from men like Edward Monroe, where he had grown old with Sarah by his side. Then he turned his horse north, toward Copper Creek, and the daughter he hadn't seen in 15 years, leaving dreams of what might have been to scatter in the dust behind him. The northern trail out of Redemption Springs wound through hills that grew progressively higher and more rugged as Thomas rode. He pushed his horse harder than was wise, knowing that every hour could make the difference between reaching Rebecca before Monroe's men or finding her already in their clutches. The sun sank toward the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. To Thomas, it simply meant darkness was coming, and with it, the increased danger of ambush. He made camp reluctantly when it became too dark to safely navigate the narrow trail, choosing a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock where his fire wouldn't be visible from a distance. As he chewed on jerky and sipped coffee that was little more than colored water, he found himself taking out the locket Sarah had given him. The silver caught the firelight as he opened it, revealing the tiny portrait inside. Sarah, looking serene and beautiful, himself younger and unbroken, and between them, the infant Rebecca with her mother's eyes and his dark hair. 15 years, a lifetime. He had missed everything. Rebecca's first steps, her first day of school, her transformation from child to young woman. Now she was grown, scarred by violence he should have been there to prevent. The familiar guilt threatened to overwhelm him, but Thomas pushed it aside. Guilt wouldn't help Rebecca now. Action would. He snapped the locket closed and tucked it away, then checked his weapons one final time before settling against his saddle for a few hours of restless sleep, one hand never straying far from his Colt. Dawn found him already on the trail, moving through terrain that grew increasingly unfamiliar. By mid-morning, he reached the split at Widow's Peak, where a weathered signpost offered directions to settlements Thomas had never heard of. Following Sarah's map, he took the Eastern Fork, a trail less traveled that soon narrowed as it entered Rattlesnake Canyon. The name proved apt. Twice he had to halt while diamondbacks slithered across the path ahead. Once his horse nearly stepped on a coiled rattler hidden in shadow. The canyon walls rose high on either side, creating a natural corridor that made Thomas increasingly uneasy. This was perfect country for an ambush, and he found himself scanning the rim above, watching for movement, for the telltale glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. By midday, the canyon began to widen again, opening into a valley nestled among the foothills. According to Sarah's map, Margaret's place should be just ahead, tucked against the northern slope where a small stream provided water year-round. Thomas slowed his approach, alert for any sign of danger. He topped a small rise and paused, studying the cabin that came into view below. It was well built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch wrapping around two sides. A small barn stood nearby, with a corral where several horses grazed. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary, and that made Thomas's instincts scream in warning. There was no movement, no smoke from the chimney, despite the chill in the air. No one working in the small garden plot beside the cabin. He dismounted and ground-tied his horse in a copse of trees, then proceeded on foot, his Colt drawn and ready. Moving from cover to cover, Thomas approached the cabin from the blind side, away from the windows. He reached the wall and pressed himself against it, listening intently. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps, no creaking floorboards. Slowly, he edged toward the corner and peered around it at the front of the cabin. The door stood slightly ajar, another warning sign that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. Taking a deep breath, Thomas moved swiftly to the door, pushing it fully open with the barrel of his gun, while staying to one side of the frame. No shots greeted him, no movement from within. After counting to 3, he swung into the doorway, gun raised, ready to fire. The cabin's interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside, but as his eyes adjusted, Thomas could see signs of a struggle. Overturned furniture, broken crockery on the floor, a dark stain that could only be blood soaking into the rough-hewn planks. "Rebecca?" he called, his voice echoing in the empty space. No response. "Margaret!" Still nothing. Thomas moved through the cabin methodically, checking each room, finding more evidence of violence, but no bodies. In what was clearly a woman's bedroom, he found a shattered mirror, and beside it on the dresser, a hairbrush with strands of dark hair caught in the bristles. He picked it up, studying the hair, the same color as his own had been before time had silvered it, Rebecca's. Anger coiled tight in his chest as he continued his search. In the kitchen, he found a note pinned to the table with a hunting knife, a crude, effective message. He pulled the knife free and read the hastily scrawled words, "Blackwood, we have your daughter. Midnight. Devil's Backbone. Come alone or she dies." The paper crumpled in Thomas's fist as his fingers clenched involuntarily. So Monroe already knew he was back. Sarah had been right. The judge had eyes everywhere. Thomas slid the knife into his belt and moved back outside, scanning the area with new purpose. The tracks were easy enough to follow, at least 6 horses, heading east toward the ragged ridge locals called Devil's Backbone. From the depth of the prints and the space between them, the riders had been moving fast, probably no more than a few hours ahead of him. If he pushed hard, he might catch up before they reached their destination, perhaps create an opportunity that didn't involve walking into an obvious trap. He returned to his horse, mounting quickly and setting off on the trail of Monroe's men. As he rode, Thomas mentally cataloged his weapons: the Colt on his hip with 36 rounds in his gun belt, the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard with another 20 rounds, the Bowie knife in his boot, and now the hunting knife from the cabin. Against at least 6 men, probably more waiting at Devil's Backbone, the odds were long. But Thomas had faced worse and survived, though not without scars to show for it. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, shadows lengthening across the land. Thomas pushed his horse as hard as he dared, following the clear trail left by Monroe's men. They weren't trying to hide their passage, another sign that this was a deliberate trap. They wanted him to follow, wanted him to walk right into whatever they had planned at Devil's Backbone. And he would oblige them, because the alternative meant abandoning Rebecca to whatever fate Monroe had decreed for her. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas caught sight of Devil's Backbone, a jagged ridge that resembled the spines of some massive beast rising from the earth. At its base, nestled among tumbled boulders, he spotted the flicker of a campfire. He reined in his horse and dismounted, securing the animal in a stand of scrubby pines before continuing on foot. Moving silently through the gathering darkness, he approached the camp, staying downwind to prevent the horses from catching his scent. From his vantage point behind a large boulder, Thomas surveyed the scene below. The fire illuminated 7 men, all armed, gathered around a woman tied to a pine tree at the edge of the clearing. Even from a distance, he could tell it was Rebecca. She had Sarah's graceful build, but his coloring. Dark hair falling over a face held proudly despite her captors. One of the men approached her, saying something Thomas couldn't hear. Rebecca responded by spitting in his face, earning herself a backhanded slap that snapped her head to the side. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger of his Winchester, the urge to put a bullet through the man's head nearly overwhelming. But that would leave 6 more, all with clear shots at Rebecca. He forced himself to wait, to think, to plan. Charging in would get them both killed. He needed to be smarter than that, needed to use the darkness and the element of surprise to even the odds. Settling into position, Thomas began to map out his approach, determined that by morning, Every man who had laid hands on his daughter would be feeding the vultures. The night deepened around Devil's Backbone, the campfire below burning down to embers as most of Monroe's men settled into sleep. They had left only 2 guards, one watching the trail from town, the other positioned near Rebecca, who remained bound to the pine tree. Thomas had spent the hours of waiting studying their patterns, identifying the leader, a burly man with a distinctive red beard whom the others called Matthews, noting which men slept closest to their weapons, which seemed most alert, which most careless. Now, with midnight approaching, he prepared to move. The plan was simple, out of necessity. Eliminate the sentries, silently, free Rebecca, then use the confusion of a surprise attack to deal with the remaining men. Thomas checked his knife, ensuring it would slide free of its sheath without sound, then began his descent, moving from shadow to shadow with the patience of a man accustomed to hunting both animals and men. The first sentry fell without a sound. Thomas's hand clamped over his mouth as the knife found its mark between his ribs, angled upward into the heart. He lowered the body gently to the ground, then moved toward the second guard, the one watching Rebecca. This would be trickier. The man had positioned himself where the firelight would show anyone approaching, and Rebecca might give away Thomas's presence if she spotted him first. He circled wide, coming up behind the guard from the direction of the sleeping men. 10 feet from his target, Thomas's boot dislodged a small stone that clattered against rock. The guard turned, his hand dropping to his gun, eyes scanning the darkness. Thomas froze, becoming part of the shadows, hardly daring to breathe. After a long moment, the guard relaxed, turning back toward Rebecca. Thomas closed the distance in 3 swift steps, his knife finding the man's throat before he could cry out. As the guard crumpled, Rebecca's eyes widened in shock, then recognition. Thomas pressed a finger to his lips as he approached, cutting through her bonds with quick, efficient strokes of his knife. "Thomas Blackwood," she whispered, as her hands came free, rubbing circulation back into her wrists. "Mother said you'd come." There was something in her voice, not quite hope, not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of both. Thomas noted the bruise darkening her cheek where she'd been struck, the dried blood at the corner of her mouth, and felt the cold rage building inside him again. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice barely audible as he sliced through the ropes binding her ankles. Rebecca nodded, her eyes, so like Sarah's, never leaving his face. "Then, we need to move. Now, my horse is just over the ridge." He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. Up close, he could see how young she was, how vulnerable despite the defiance in her posture. 20 years old at most, and already carrying scars, both visible and hidden. They had taken 3 steps toward the edge of the camp when a voice rang out behind them. Well, well, the famous Thomas Blackwood, right on schedule. Thomas turned slowly, pushing Rebecca behind him, to see Matthews standing by the fire, revolver aimed squarely at Thomas's chest. The other men were stirring now, reaching for weapons, forming a loose circle around them. "Judge Monroe said you'd come for her," Matthews continued, a cruel smile playing across his bearded face. "Said a man like you couldn't resist playing hero, not when it came to your own blood." Thomas kept his expression neutral, his right hand hovering near his Colt, calculating angles, distances, the likelihood of drawing and firing before Matthews could pull his trigger. "Monroe," he said, the name like ash in his mouth. "Still hiding behind other men's guns, I see. Some things never change. Matthew's smile faltered slightly, his grip on the revolver tightening. Thomas recognized the look. A man trying to prove himself, dangerous in his insecurity, prone to mistakes. "The judge is a busy man," Matthews replied. "Too busy to deal with trash like you personally. That's what he pays us for." He gestured with his free hand, and two of his men moved forward to grab Rebecca. She fought, landing a solid kick to one man's knee that drew a howl of pain, but the second caught her arm, twisting it behind her back until she gasped and went still. Thomas felt something snap inside him at the sound of her pain, something that had been holding back the darker parts of his nature. "Let her go," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Let her go, and you all get to live through the night." The men exchanged glances, some uneasy, others amused at what they perceived as empty bravado. Matthews laughed outright, the sound echoing off the surrounding rocks. "You're not exactly in a position to be making threats, Blackwood. In case you hadn't noticed, there's 7 of us and 1 of you. And we've got your precious daughter." Thomas nodded, as if conceding the point. "7 of you," he agreed. "That's true enough." His hand moved in a blur, the Colt clearing its holster and firing twice before most of the men had time to react. The first bullet took Matthews between the eyes. The second found the heart of the man holding Rebecca. "Now there's 5, Thomas said as both bodies crumpled to the ground. Rebecca staggered free, diving for cover behind a boulder, as the remaining men finally overcame their shock and opened fire. Bullets whined past Thomas as he rolled behind a fallen log, returning fire with methodical precision. A third man fell, clutching his throat, gun tumbling from nerveless fingers. The fourth took a bullet in the chest, but managed to fire back, the shot grazing Thomas's shoulder and spinning him half around. He recovered quickly, squeezing off another round that caught his attacker in the face, ending the threat permanently. 4 down, 3 to go, and Thomas was bleeding now, his reactions slowing. The remaining men had taken cover, shooting from behind rocks and trees, more cautious now that they'd seen half their number fall in less than a minute. Thomas used the respite to reload, hands moving automatically while his eyes never stopped scanning for targets. He caught movement to his left, one of Monroe's men trying to circle behind him, and fired without conscious thought, the bullet finding its mark with unerring accuracy. 5 down. "Rebecca," he called, keeping his voice low. "Get to the horse, over the ridge, in the pines." He heard movement from her direction, knew she was following his instructions, and felt a flash of pride at her courage. The girl had spirit, had survived things that would break most people. Monroe's blood ran in her veins, not Monroe's. The thought gave him strength as he prepared to deal with the last 2 gunmen. They came at him together, perhaps hoping to overwhelm him with simultaneous fire. It was a sound strategy, but they hadn't counted on Thomas's lifetime of violence, his instinctive understanding of how men moved in battle. He waited until the last possible moment, until they had committed to their charge, then rose from behind the log and fired twice more. The first man dropped immediately, a bullet in his heart. The second staggered, wounded but still dangerous, his gun coming up for a final shot. Thomas felt the impact before he heard the report, a sledgehammer blow to his side that knocked him back a step. Pain blossomed, hot and familiar, but he kept his feet, kept his aim, and put a final bullet through his attacker's throat. The man fell backward, dead before he hit the ground, his blood mingling with that of his companions in the dirt of Devil's Backbone. Thomas holstered his Colt and pressed his hand to his side, feeling the warmth of blood seeping between his fingers. "Thomas?" Rebecca's voice came from the darkness, uncertain, afraid. He turned to see her standing at the edge of the clearing, her face pale in the dying firelight. Her eyes dropped to his bloodied side, widening in alarm. "You're hurt." She moved toward him, but Thomas waved her back with his free hand. "We need to move," he said, his voice rougher than before as he fought to control the pain. "There'll be more coming. Monroe won't stop with these 7. Rebecca hesitated, clearly torn between concern for his injury and recognition of the truth in his words. Finally, she nodded, turning to lead the way to his horse. Thomas followed, each step sending fresh waves of pain through his side. The bullet had gone clean through, he thought. A small mercy, but one he'd take. He'd survived worse. What mattered now was getting Rebecca somewhere safe. Somewhere Monroe's men couldn't find her while Thomas finished what he'd started 15 years ago. They reached his horse, the animal nickering softly in greeting. Thomas helped Rebecca mount, then pulled himself up behind her with an effort that left him lightheaded. "Head west," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear as he reached around her to take the reins. "I know a place." Rebecca nodded, leaning back slightly against his chest, as if unconsciously seeking support. Thomas felt something stir in him at the gesture, a protectiveness that went beyond duty or obligation. This was his daughter, his blood, and he had failed her for 15 years. "I'm sorry," he said as they rode away from Devil's Backbone, leaving 7 dead men for the scavengers to find. Rebecca didn't respond immediately, and Thomas wondered if she'd heard him over the rhythm of the horse's hooves. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "Mother said you would be." There was neither accusation nor forgiveness in the words, merely a statement of fact. Thomas accepted it as such, guiding the horse through the darkness toward the one place he thought they might find temporary sanctuary. By dawn, they had put miles between themselves and Devil's Backbone, crossing streams to obscure their trail, taking game paths instead of established trails. The sun rose to find them approaching a small cabin nestled in a grove of aspens, their leaves just beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn. It was a simple structure, weathered by years of neglect, but still standing, still offering the promise of shelter. "What is this place?" Rebecca asked as Thomas dismounted stiffly, his side burning with each movement. He helped her down before answering, taking a moment to survey their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. Satisfied they were alone, at least for now, he led the horse toward a lean-to beside the cabin that might generously be called a stable. "It belonged to an old friend," he said finally. "Jim Rawlins saved my life after Monroe had me shot, brought me here to heal up." Rebecca followed him into the cabin after he checked it for signs of other visitors. The interior was dusty but intact. A table, chairs, a stone fireplace, a narrow bed against one wall. "Where is he now, your friend?" she asked, watching as Thomas moved with increasing difficulty to light a fire in the cold hearth. He grunted as he straightened up, his hand going to his wounded side where blood had soaked through his shirt and coat. "Dead," Thomas replied simply. 5 years back, influenza took him." He gestured toward the bed. "Rest if you want. We should be safe here for a little while." Rebecca ignored his suggestion, instead approaching him with determination in her green eyes, Sarah's eyes, looking out of a face that otherwise mirrored his own younger self. Without asking permission, she helped him remove his coat and shirt, revealing the bullet wound beneath. It was still bleeding sluggishly, the flesh around it angry and inflamed. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to one of the chairs. Thomas obeyed, too weak to argue, as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. Rebecca found a kettle and filled it from a rain barrel outside, then set it to heat over the fire. "Mother taught me about wounds," she explained, as she searched the cabin's sparse shelves for supplies. She said it was a necessary skill for a woman alone in a place like Redemption Springs. There was something in her voice when she said this, a bitterness that seemed too heavy for someone so young to carry. Thomas watched as she located a battered first aid kit, her movements efficient and practiced as she laid out bandages, a bottle of whiskey, and a needle and thread. "Your mother is a remarkable woman," he said quietly. Rebecca paused in her preparations, her back to him, shoulders suddenly tense. "She raised you alone, made a success of the saloon, survived in a town controlled by Walter Monroe. Not many could have done that." Rebecca turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "She told me about you. All my life, stories about Thomas Blackwood, the man who loved us but had to leave to keep us safe." She dampened a cloth and began cleaning the wound in his side, her touch gentle despite the edge in her voice. "I used to imagine you coming back for us, sweeping in like some hero from a dime novel to rescue us from Redemption Springs. I outgrew that fantasy a long time ago." Thomas winced, both from the physical pain of her ministrations and the emotional wound her words inflicted. "I should have come back sooner," he admitted. "Should never have left in the first place. I thought," he hissed as she poured whiskey over the wound, the alcohol burning like fire. "I thought Monroe would leave you both alone if I was gone, if he believed me dead. I thought you'd be safer without me drawing his attention, his hatred." Rebecca threaded the needle with steady hands, preparing to stitch the wound closed. "Hold still," she instructed, and Thomas braced himself for the additional pain. As she worked, she continued speaking, her voice detached, as if discussing a stranger rather than her own life. "Monroe never forgot about us, never let anyone else forget either. We were marked, the wife and daughter of Thomas Blackwood, the man who dared to stand against the great Judge Monroe. Mother built a life for us anyway, made herself valuable enough to the town that even Monroe couldn't touch her directly. But his son," she tied off the last stitch and began bandaging the wound, her hands still gentle even as her words grew harder. "Edward Monroe grew up watching his father's hatred. He learned it well. When he and his friends took me," her voice faltered for the first time, a tremor running through her hands. "When they took me, he said it was because Blackwood blood needed to be taught its place. Said his father had let us get too comfortable, too proud. Said it was time I learned what happens to women who don't know their station." Thomas's hand shot out, catching Rebecca's wrist as she finished securing the bandage. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw the scared young woman beneath the hard exterior she had built to protect herself. "What did they do to you, Rebecca?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She pulled away from his grip, turning to pack up the medical supplies with movements that had become abruptly mechanical, precise. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "Edward Monroe is dead. I put a bullet in his black heart, watched the light go out of his eyes, and felt nothing but relief." She closed the first aid kit with a decisive snap. "The others will follow him soon enough. I've made sure of that." Thomas recognized something in her tone, something he had heard in his own voice over the years. The cold certainty of vengeance, the promise of retribution. "What do you mean?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Rebecca moved to the cabin's single window, looking out at the aspen grove, as if seeing something beyond the golden leaves and slender white trunks. "Before I escaped, I heard them talking, planning. Edward's friends, the ones who helped him take me. They're all sons of powerful men in Monroe's pocket. They thought I was unconscious, thought the drugs they'd given me had put me under again. She turned back to Thomas, and in that moment, he saw himself in her completely. Not just in her features, but in the cold fire burning behind her eyes. I know their names, their habits, where they'll be and when. I was going to deal with them one by one, until Mother sent me away to Aunt Margaret's. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, bitter and knowing. And now Monroe's men have brought me right back to where I need to be. It's almost like fate, isn't it? Thomas struggled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his side. Rebecca, listen to me. Vengeance is a path that doesn't end. Trust me on this. I've walked it for 15 years, and all it's brought me is more blood, more graves. He reached for her, but she stepped back, maintaining the distance between them, physical and emotional. Let me handle Monroe and his men. You've already risked enough, suffered enough. Rebecca shook her head, a strand of dark hair falling across her face. You don't understand, she said, and there was something broken in her voice now, something that made Thomas's heart ache with a father's helplessness. They didn't just hurt me, Thomas. They broke something inside me, something I don't think can be fixed. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, feel their hands. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking younger, vulnerable. I need to be the one to end this. I need them to know it was me who destroyed them, just as they tried to destroy me. Thomas closed the distance between them, ignoring her initial resistance as he gently turned her to face him. Rebecca, he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd thought long buried. Look at me. Really look. She raised her eyes reluctantly to his, and he let her see everything. All the scars, all the darkness, all the years of violence etched into his face. This is what vengeance does to a person. It hollows you out until there's nothing left but the next target, the next kill. Is that what you want for yourself? She stared back at him, unflinching. What I want, she said slowly, deliberately, is to never feel helpless again. What I want is for Edward Monroe's friends to experience the same fear, the same pain they inflicted on me. What I want is for Judge Monroe to lose everything he values, just as he took everything from us. Her chin lifted in a gesture so reminiscent of Sarah that Thomas felt a pang of recognition. If that makes me like you, then so be it. Better that than to remain a victim. Thomas released her, stepping back as he recognized the futility of trying to dissuade her. Rebecca had made her choice. Perhaps had it made for her the moment Edward Monroe and his friends took her. He could see the determination in her stance, the resolve that mirrored his own. She was his daughter in more than just blood. She had inherited his capacity for vengeance, his unflinching willingness to do whatever was necessary. The realization filled him with both pride and profound sorrow. Then we do it together, he said finally. Monroe, his cronies, Edward's friends, all of them. But we do it smart, we do it careful, and we make damn sure your mother doesn't suffer for our actions. He moved to the table, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. Tell me everything you know about these men. Every detail, every weakness. If we're going to bring down Monroe's entire power structure, we need to plan this perfectly. Rebecca joined him at the table, the first hint of real trust in her eyes as she recognized his acceptance of her choice, his willingness to fight alongside her rather than shield her. There are 5 of them left, she began. Edward's closest friends, the ones who were with him that night. David Collins, the banker's son. Henry Wells, whose father owns the largest ranch in the county. James Porter, the sheriff's boy. Michael Stevens, who runs the freight company now that his father's dead, and William Grant, the judge's nephew. Thomas listened as she detailed what she knew of each man, their habits, their weaknesses, the places they frequented. With each word, a plan began to form in his mind, a strategy that would strike at the heart of Monroe's power, while giving Rebecca the justice she sought. It would be bloody work, dangerous beyond measure, but Thomas had long ago accepted that his life would end violently. At least this way, it would have meaning. It would serve a purpose beyond his own revenge. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, father and daughter bent their heads together over the rough table in Jim Rawlins's abandoned cabin, plotting the downfall of the most powerful man in 3 counties and everyone who served him. Outside, the aspen leaves trembled in the breeze, gold against the deep blue of the Colorado sky, nature indifferent to the dark plans being laid within. And in Redemption Springs, Walter Monroe sat in his grand office, unaware that his reign was about to face its greatest challenge from the man he'd failed to kill 15 years ago, and the daughter who had inherited that man's deadly determination. 3 days later, Thomas and Rebecca rode into Redemption Springs under cover of darkness, taking a circuitous route to avoid the main streets and the watchful eyes of Monroe's men. They had spent the intervening time refining their plan, gathering supplies, and allowing Thomas's wound to heal enough for what lay ahead. Now, as they tethered their horses in an abandoned livery stable at the edge of town, Rebecca turned to her father, her face half hidden in shadow. "Are you sure Mother will help us?" she asked, doubt creeping into her voice for the first time since they'd left the cabin. "This plan puts her at risk. Monroe could take everything from her if he discovers her involvement." Thomas checked his weapons one final time, the Colt on his hip, freshly cleaned and loaded, the Winchester in its scabbard, the knife in his boot. Each movement was deliberate, practiced, the ritual of a man preparing for battle. "Your mother is stronger than you know," he replied, his voice low. "Stronger than I knew 15 years ago. She'll help because she wants Monroe gone as much as we do, and because she wants you safe. That's always been her priority, keeping you safe." He secured his hat low over his eyes, then nodded toward the back alleys that would lead them to the Rusty Nail. "Stay close. Keep your head down. Most people won't be looking for a man and a young woman together. They'll be watching for you alone." They moved through the sleeping town like ghosts, avoiding the few lamplit windows and the occasional late-night reveler stumbling home from one of the saloons. Redemption Springs was smaller than many frontier towns, but it had grown since Thomas's time, sprawling outward from the main street with new buildings, new businesses, all under Walter Monroe's control. The judge's influence was visible everywhere, in the imposing courthouse at the town's center, in the well-maintained streets near his mansion on the hill, in the deference shown to his name even in casual conversation. The Rusty Nail's back entrance was unguarded, just as Thomas had hoped. He knocked softly in the pattern he and Sarah had established years ago. 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 more. For a moment, there was no response, and Thomas wondered if Sarah still remembered, if she still listened for that particular rhythm after all this time. Then the door opened a crack, Sarah's wary face appearing in the narrow gap, her expression transforming from caution to relief as she recognized them. "Rebecca," she breathed, pulling her daughter into a fierce embrace as soon as they were inside the storeroom. Thank God. She held Rebecca at arm's length, examining her for injuries, her eyes lingering on the fading bruise on her daughter's cheek. Then her gaze shifted to Thomas, taking in his stiff movements, the way he favored his left side. "You're hurt," she observed, the concern in her voice surprising him after 15 years of separation. "It's nothing," he assured her, though they all knew it was a lie. "Monroe's men found us at your sister's place. There was a fight. Rebecca helped patch me up." Sarah's eyes moved between them, noting something new in their interaction, a connection that hadn't existed before. She seemed about to comment on it, then apparently thought better of it, leading them instead through the storeroom toward her office. "Monroe knows you're back," she said as she closed and locked the office door behind them. "His men have been watching the saloon, asking questions about both of you. The whole town's on edge. 7 bodies found at Devil's Backbone, all men known to work for the judge." She looked directly at Thomas as she said this, no accusation in her voice, merely stating facts. "He's put $1,000 bounty on your head. 2,000 for Rebecca, alive only." Thomas exchanged a glance with Rebecca, who nodded almost imperceptibly. This was expected, part of their calculations. "We have a plan," he told Sarah, keeping his voice low despite the closed door. "But we need your help to make it work." Sarah moved to her desk, sitting behind it with the poise of a woman accustomed to making difficult decisions. She gestured for them to continue, her expression grave but determined. "Monroe has to be stopped," Rebecca said, taking the lead as they had agreed. "Not just for what he did to us, but for everyone in Redemption Springs. As long as he controls the town, no one is truly safe." She outlined their strategy, a coordinated attack on Monroe's power structure, targeting his key allies and supporters simultaneously, creating enough chaos and confusion to allow them to reach the judge himself. Sarah listened without interruption, her hands folded on the desk before her, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. When Rebecca finished, Sarah was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, as if seeing beyond the walls of her small office to the potential consequences of what they proposed. "What you're talking about isn't justice," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "It's revolution. You're talking about tearing down the entire power structure of this town in a single night." She looked at Thomas, something unreadable in her green eyes. "Is this your influence? Teaching our daughter that violence is the only solution?" Before Thomas could respond, Rebecca leaned forward, her hands flat on Sarah's desk. "This isn't about Thomas," she said, a quiet intensity in her voice. "This is about what I experienced, what I endured at the hands of men who thought they were untouchable because of their connection to Walter Monroe. This is about ensuring no other woman in this town suffers the same fate." She straightened, her shoulders set in a line of determination. "I made this choice, Mother. Thomas tried to talk me out of it. He wanted to handle Monroe himself, to spare me from more bloodshed." Sarah's expression softened as she studied her daughter, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman Rebecca had become. No longer the girl who needed protection, but someone forged in fire, tempered by trauma, into something harder, more resolute. "And what happens after?" she asked. "If you succeed, if Monroe and his allies are removed, what then? Do you think the town will simply accept this changing of the guard? That there won't be repercussions, investigations, more violence?" It was Thomas who answered, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "We've thought about that. Once Monroe is gone, we'll disappear, both of us. You'll be the only one left in Redemption Springs, Sarah. And you've built a reputation, connections, respect. No one will believe you had anything to do with what happened. You'll be safe." He leaned against the wall, conserving his strength for what lay ahead. Rebecca and I will head west, maybe to California or Oregon. Somewhere Monroe's name means nothing. And you think I'll just stay behind? Sarah asked, a hint of the old fire flashing in her eyes. After 15 years of building a life here, of enduring Monroe's shadow over everything I do, you think I'll remain in this town alone while you take our daughter to start a new life without me? She shook her head, a strand of honey-brown hair escaping its pins to fall across her face. No. If you're doing this, if you're risking everything to free this town from Monroe, then we all leave together afterward, the three of us. Thomas exchanged a startled glance with Rebecca, who looked equally surprised by her mother's declaration. This wasn't part of the plan, wasn't something they had considered. Sarah, Thomas began, but she cut him off with a raised hand, her expression brooking no argument. I'm not asking for promises, Thomas. I'm not asking for the life we might have had if Monroe hadn't destroyed it 15 years ago. I'm telling you that if this is happening, we face the aftermath together, as a family, broken as we may be. A heavy silence fell over the office as her words sank in. Family. The concept felt foreign to Thomas after so many years alone. A ghost drifting from town to town, taking odd jobs that required his particular skills, never staying long enough to form connections. Yet something in Sarah's proposal resonated deep within him, striking a chord he'd thought long silenced. He looked at Rebecca, seeking her reaction, and found her watching him with an expression that mirrored his own uncertainty. Together, then, Thomas said finally, making the decision that felt right, that felt like a step toward redemption rather than further into darkness. If we succeed tonight, we leave Redemption Springs as a family. Head west, start fresh. The words felt strange on his tongue, as if he were speaking a language long forgotten, but the relief on Rebecca's face told him it was the right choice. She had lost so much, had been broken in ways he could never fully understand. Perhaps the promise of a future, of rebuilding what Monroe had shattered, was what she needed most. Sarah nodded, accepting his decision with the same quiet dignity that had always been her hallmark. Then let's make sure we all survive to see morning, she said, turning practical once more. She rose from her desk, moving to a cabinet in the corner of the office. From it, she removed a shotgun and a box of shells, setting them on the desk with practiced ease. I assume I have a role to play in this plan of yours? Rebecca smiled, the expression transforming her face, making her look younger, more like the girl she should have been allowed to remain. We were hoping you might, she said, and proceeded to explain the part they needed Sarah to play. Utilizing her connections in town, her knowledge of the movements of Monroe's allies, her access to places neither Thomas nor Rebecca could go without raising alarm. Sarah listened attentively, asking pointed questions, suggesting refinements to their strategy that revealed a tactical mind Thomas had never fully appreciated during their time together. As the night deepened around them, the three Blackwoods bent their heads together over Sarah's desk, voices low as they finalized their plans for the dismantling of Walter Monroe's empire. Outside, Redemption Springs slept on, unaware that by dawn, nothing in the town would remain the same. And in his mansion on the hill, Judge Walter Monroe sat in his study, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand, gazing out at the town he considered his personal kingdom, blissfully ignorant of the storm gathering just beyond his sight. The following night found Thomas positioned on the roof of the general store, Winchester rifle at the ready, watching the main street through a gap in the false front of the building. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the sheriff's office, the bank, and the entrance to the saloon where Michael Stevens and Henry Wells were meeting to discuss business. Or so they believed. In reality, they had been lured there by carefully planted information, part of the elaborate trap Thomas and Rebecca had set. Across the street, hidden in the shadows of an alley, Rebecca waited with a revolver Thomas had provided. Smaller than his Colt, but no less deadly in the right hands. Her task was to intercept James Porter, the sheriff's son, when he emerged from the jailhouse for his usual evening patrol. Sarah, meanwhile, was inside the Rusty Nail, serving drinks with her customary grace while keeping watch for any sign that their plan had been discovered. Thomas checked his pocket watch in the fading light. 7:30, right on schedule. Below, the door to the sheriff's office opened, and James Porter stepped out, adjusting his gun belt with the casual arrogance of a man who believed his father's position protected him from all consequences. Thomas tensed, watching as Porter began his patrol, moving past the alley where Rebecca waited. He could just make out her figure as she stepped from the shadows. Calling out to Porter with a voice pitched low enough that only he could hear. Porter stopped, turning toward the alley with his hand moving to his gun. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the man's surprise when he recognized Rebecca, could imagine the cruel smile that would spread across his face at finding his prey delivered so conveniently. As Porter followed Rebecca deeper into the alley, Thomas shifted his attention to the bank, where David Collins would be working late, as he did every Thursday night, tallying the week's deposits before the Friday payday for the nearby ranches. The bank's windows glowed with lamplight, Collins's silhouette visible as he moved between the counter and the vault. According to their information, gathered from Sarah's conversations with the town's gossips and Rebecca's own observations before her abduction, Collins would leave at 8, walking the short distance to his father's house on Maple Street. That's when Thomas would intercept him, separating another of Monroe's allies from the herd. A flicker of movement in the alley caught Thomas's attention. Rebecca emerged alone, nodding once in his direction to signal that Porter had been dealt with. 1 down, 4 to go. Thomas felt a complicated mixture of emotions, pride in his daughter's efficiency, sorrow that she had been forced to become a killer, understanding of the necessity that drove her. Rebecca disappeared around the corner, heading toward her next target, William Grant, the judge's nephew, who would be finishing his evening meal at the hotel restaurant. Thomas returned his focus to Collins, who was now extinguishing the lamps in the bank, preparing to leave for the night. Right on time, the banker's son emerged, locking the door behind him before starting down the boardwalk toward home. Thomas moved silently across the rooftop, descending the back stairs to intercept Collins at the planned location, the narrow passage between the livery stable and the blacksmith shop, a shortcut Collins took each night. The confrontation was brief. Collins never saw Thomas emerge from the shadows, never had a chance to reach for the small derringer he carried in his vest pocket. A single knife thrust, silent and efficient, and another of Edward Monroe's friends crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him in the dirt. Thomas dragged the body deeper into the shadows, covering it with a horse blanket from the livery. It wouldn't be discovered until morning, by which time their plan would be complete. One way or another, 2 down, 3 to go. Thomas made his way toward the Rusty Nail, keeping to the alleys and shadows, avoiding the few townspeople still about at this hour. Sarah had arranged for Stevens and Wells to be seated at a corner table their backs to the wall, but their attention focused on the card game she had organized for their entertainment. As Thomas slipped through the back entrance, he caught sight of Rebecca entering through the batwing doors at the front, her dress and demeanor transformed. With her hair pinned up and her mother's shawl around her shoulders, she looked like any respectable young woman coming to find a family member in the saloon. The plan called for precision timing now. Thomas positioned himself near the storeroom door, out of sight of the main floor, but with a clear view of the table where Stevens and Wells sat, their attention now drawn to Rebecca as she made her way through the crowded room. Sarah intercepted her, playing the part of the concerned mother, loudly asking what she was doing in such an establishment at this hour. The conversation drew all eyes in the saloon, including those of Stevens and Wells, who recognized Rebecca despite her changed appearance. Thomas saw Wells nudge Stevens, saw them exchange knowing looks as they watched the interaction between mother and daughter. Sarah was guiding Rebecca toward the back, toward the office, creating the impression that she was removing her wayward daughter from the undesirable environment. As they passed near the storeroom, Thomas caught Sarah's eye, a fleeting glance that conveyed everything he needed to know. Stevens and Wells had taken the bait. They would follow, driven by the opportunity to capture the fugitive Rebecca Blackwood and claim Monroe's substantial reward. Minutes later, as Thomas had anticipated, Stevens and Wells made their excuses to the other card players and headed toward the back of the saloon, trying to appear casual but betrayed by the eagerness in their stride. They knocked on Sarah's office door, no doubt concocting some pretext for their intrusion. When Sarah opened it, they pushed past her, only to find the office empty. No sign of Rebecca, just an open window suggesting her escape. As they turned to leave, frustrated by their quarry's disappearance, Thomas stepped from the shadows of the storeroom, blocking their exit. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the chill of a mountain winter, "I believe you knew my daughter." The recognition in their eyes was immediate, followed by fear as they reached for their guns. Thomas was faster, had always been faster. 2 shots from his Colt, so close together they sounded almost like a single report, and Stevens and Wells joined their friends in death, their bodies crumpling to the floor of Sarah's office. Sarah closed the door quickly, muffling the sound of the gunshots from the main saloon, where the piano player had fortuitously begun a rousing rendition of Buffalo Gals at precisely the right moment. "4 down," she said, her voice steady despite the violence she had just witnessed. She looked at Thomas, a question in her eyes. "Rebecca?" "On her way to deal with Grant," Thomas replied, holstering his gun and helping her move the bodies into the storeroom. They would be discovered eventually, but not before the final act of their plan unfolded. Once that's done, we move on Monroe himself. Tonight ends his reign over Redemption Springs, one way or another. Sarah nodded, her face set in lines of grim determination. This was the woman who had survived 15 years under Monroe's shadow, who had built a life from the ashes of what they had lost. "Be careful," she said, as Thomas prepared to leave through the back door, to make his way to the rendezvous point where he would meet Rebecca after she had eliminated William Grant. "Both of you." There was something in her voice, not just concern, but a hint of the future they had discussed, the possibility of a life beyond this night of violence. Thomas paused, struck by a sudden urge to reassure her, to offer some promise of that future. "We will," he said, the words inadequate to express the tangle of emotions he felt. 15 years ago, he had left without a proper goodbye, believing he was protecting her and Rebecca by his absence. Now he was leaving again, but with the intention to return, to build something new from the wreckage of their past. Sarah seemed to understand what he couldn't articulate, offering a small smile that spoke of hope amidst the darkness of their current path. Thomas slipped out into the night, moving through the familiar yet changed landscape of Redemption Springs toward Monroe's mansion on the hill. As he went, he thought of Rebecca, following her own path of vengeance against the men who had broken her. He had seen the change in her these past days. Not healing, perhaps, but a reclaiming of power, a refusal to remain a victim. Whether that was enough to mend what had been broken inside her, only time would tell. The rendezvous point was a stand of cottonwoods at the base of the hill leading to Monroe's mansion, providing cover while offering a clear view of the approach. Thomas arrived first, settling into a shadowed spot to wait for Rebecca, his mind turning over the final phase of their plan. Monroe would be in his study at this hour, alone with his whiskey and his inflated sense of security. The judge kept 2 guards at the front entrance, but the back of the mansion, with its kitchen door and servants' entrance, was less well protected. Rebecca appeared like a wraith from the darkness, moving with a silent grace that reminded Thomas painfully of the girl she had been, of the woman she might have become under different circumstances. "Grant?" he asked as she joined him beneath the trees. Rebecca nodded, her face calm, almost serene in the moonlight filtering through the branches. "It's done," she said simply. "All 5 of them, just as they deserved." Thomas studied her, looking for signs of the toll this night's work must be taking. But Rebecca's expression revealed nothing beyond a grim satisfaction. She had emptied herself for this vengeance, had poured everything into the execution of their plan, leaving no room for doubt or regret or fear. In that moment, she reminded Thomas so much of himself that it hurt, a mirror reflecting the darkest parts of his nature, the capacity for violence he had hoped would die with him, rather than live on in his child. "Monroe is next," he said, pushing aside his misgivings. There would be time for reflection later, for reckoning with what they had done and who they had become. For now, they had a job to finish. "Remember the plan. I take the front, create a distraction. You come in through the kitchen. We meet at his study." Rebecca checked her revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded, her movements precise and economical. "And then we end this," she said, the words both question and statement. Thomas nodded, his hand moving to the locket in his pocket. Sarah's locket, the symbol of all that Monroe had taken from them, and the promise of what might yet be restored. "And then we end this," he agreed. Together, they started up the hill toward the mansion, father and daughter, united in purpose if not in hope, moving through the darkness like specters of justice long delayed. The confrontation with Monroe unfolded much as Thomas had anticipated. The guards at the front fell quickly to his surprise attack, never having expected anyone to approach so boldly. Inside the mansion, he moved through rooms more opulent than anything Redemption Springs had seen before. Imported furniture, expensive artwork, crystal decanters filled with liquors most townsfolk would never taste. All built on corruption, on the suffering of others, on 15 years of unchecked power. Thomas reached the study door just as a gunshot rang out from within. His heart seized in his chest as he burst through the door, Colt raised, expecting to find Rebecca in danger. Instead, he found her standing over Walter Monroe's body, the revolver still smoking in her hand, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. The judge had died at his desk, a bullet through his heart. His own gun barely cleared from its drawer. The poetic justice wasn't lost on Thomas. Monroe, who had ordered Thomas shot in the back 15 years ago, felled by a single shot from the daughter of the man he had failed to kill. "It's done," Rebecca said, her voice distant, almost hollow, as the gravity of the moment settled around them. "He recognized me, said I was just like you." She looked at Thomas, something vulnerable finally breaking through her hardened exterior. "Is that true? Am I just like you now?" Thomas holstered his gun and crossed to his daughter, seeing not the avenger who had methodically eliminated her tormentors, but the child he had left behind, the girl who had grown up without a father's protection. "No," he said softly, "you're stronger than I ever was." He reached for her hand, gently taking the revolver and setting it aside. "You survived, Rebecca. You fought back. Now it's time to live." They made their way back to the rusty nail, where Sarah waited, tension visible in every line of her body, until she saw them both return unharmed. No words were needed as she embraced them, her daughter, her long-lost husband, holding them fiercely, as if afraid they might vanish again. "It's over," Thomas told her. "We need to leave tonight, before the bodies are discovered." By dawn, Redemption Springs was far behind them, the three Blackwoods riding west toward a new beginning. The town would awaken to find Judge Monroe and his corrupt circle eliminated, a vacuum of power that would eventually be filled by better men. Or perhaps not. That was no longer their concern. As the rising sun painted the horizon in gold and crimson, Rebecca turned to Thomas, her face softened by the dawn light. "Don't break me more," she whispered, echoing the words she had spoken to her mother after her ordeal. Thomas met her gaze, seeing both Sarah's strength and his own determination reflected there, along with something new, the first fragile shoots of healing. "Never," he growled, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll break every man who ever tries to hurt you instead." It was both a promise and a farewell, to the past, to vengeance, to the darkness that had defined them both for too long. Sarah reached across the space between their horses, taking both their hands in hers. Together, the Blackwood family rode toward California and the promise of a new life, leaving behind the blood and dust of Redemption Springs. Some wounds would never fully heal. Some ghosts would never be completely exorcised, but they would face them together, broken but undefeated, damaged but not destroyed. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.